Happy Friday, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about my thesis, the origin and significance of metamorphosed ultramafic rocks in the Topologic Terrain, Buckner Quadrangle, Virginia. So that's quite a mouthful, so I went with the current title here. On this slide, it shows three things that I really liked about my project. Starting on the right, that is just visiting the outcrops, seeing the cool rocks. That particular rock happens to be a actinolite schist. And then on the left, doing petrographic work. Those are photomicrographs. So that's determining monomineralogy by looking through a petrographic microscope and identifying minerals. And then behind that is doing the bushwhacking, going to the field and collecting the rocks. In this particular area, a lot of the land is forested. Some of it, most of it is like oak, hickory forests. Well, some are, obviously human planted pine plantations, such as this photo here. And this one, some of these areas were recently harvested, so the trees are pretty short, and there's lots of brambles, and that made the bushwhacking hard, as you'll soon see. But I guess to start off, what are metamorphosed ultramafic rocks? So if you remember from basic geo, intro geo and mineralogy, ultramafic rocks are rocks that are rich in olivine and pyroxene. And we see a lot of these are the rocks that make up the mantle. They find below the basalt in the ocean, and they can also occur as mafic cumulates within like an intrusive body. But these rocks have experienced metamorphism. They experience screen shift spacing metamorphism from the Appalachian origins. And then they also have, there's been presence of water and carbon dioxide. So there's metasomatism going on that creates these compositions of chlorite, serpentine, talc, tinolite, and dolomite. So why these rocks? Answer, did you feel it? So on August 23rd, 2011, that's when we had the 5.7 plus or minus 1.1 moment magnitude earthquake that struck near the Mineral, Virginia area. And this was the most destructive earthquake since Charleston, South Carolina, 1886. That's a big deal. Here on the East Coast, we don't experience too many earthquakes all too often. And notably in this area is a nuclear generating station. And this earthquake surpassed its engineering parameters. So that was kind of worrisome. So since we were very reactive about these things, government started pumping money into these geologic studies of this area. So they started mapping many of the quadrangles in more detail around the Mineral, Virginia area. And that includes the Buckner Quadrangle, which hosts my rocks. The big geologist in this mapping is Mark Carter of the USGS, and he mapped. He did one portion. He did the Topologic Terrain. So the Buckner Quadrangle is split in half by the Topologic Terrain to the west, and then the Goochland Terrain to the east, and it was split. And Mark Carter mapped the western side, which hosts my rocks. And when he did his traverses, he noticed pods of altered ultramafic rocks. Now he, as you can see on the bottom, he gave a fairly, detailed description. But of course, these rocks are very interesting and they deserve more, so this is why he brought it to Brent. But yeah, he suggested that these rocks, he gave a pretty broad stroke of what they could be. He said they could be intrusive plug stocks, dismembered dikes and sills, or tectonically in placed rocks within the layered amphibolite. So saying they're like intrusive or pretty much ophiolites, or that is, rocks that have been abducted onto the land when an oceanic crust collided with land. Yeah, as we can see, this map, that's pretty much just what people felt. And as you can see, it is very strong. And then on the right, those are photos of the mineral area that had pretty large damage. On photo E, that is actually, I believe, an elementary school, and experienced so much damage that it had to be demolished. So yeah, they really care about what's going on in this area. So the goals of my thesis: what is the range of rock types? So look at all these, not all these Metamorphosed Ultramafic rocks are exactly the same. So I'm going to determine what's going, is one like a chlorite amphibole schist, what's pretty much the mineralogy. And then I'm going to compare my rocks to those studied by an earlier study by Brent and a research student, also within the Topologic Terrain. Those are a little bit farther to the west. And then what protoliths are represented by these rocks, and what are their implications for the rock's origin? By finding out the protolith, you can start making inferences on how the rocks got in place and what they're doing there. So Metamorphosed Ultramafic rocks in the Piedmont. So pretty much up until the 80s, there was pretty much no study on the Piedmont Ultramafics, while the Blue Ridge experienced a little better. But these guys, Miser and Keller, they pointed out that what we know about Piedmont Ultramafic rocks, metamorphosed rocks, is very lacking. But since then, several papers have been published about Piedmont Ultramafics, and those include Natalie Ushner, as earlier, and then a few others. They've looked at the rocks, and a lot of them, you can't really come to really, definite conclusions, but many of them came to the idea that they are of ophiolytic origin. But then some, like Ushner and Owens, they had some possible ophiolytic, and then some they assumed, due to the relations with the surrounding amphibolite, actually might be cumulate rocks. So the Topologic Terrain and the Topologic Formation. So initially, this was a big area of confusion for me. During junior year, I didn't realize there was a difference, or I was confused with the fact that they share like the same name. So the Topologic Terrain is the larger grouping of rocks that share. So within the Appalachian origin, there's these terrains, or broad areas of similar geology. And the Topologic Terrain is largely a magmatic track with the Milton terrain. And then it was in place during the tectonic orogeny. And then within the Topologic Terrain is the Topologic Formation, and it is interpreted as a volcanic arc that collided during the orogeny. So if you remember, I believe Terry's talk, she had a good diagram showing an arc colliding with Laurentia, and so I'm pretty much on the other side of that. I'm on the oceanic side of the western side of that arc. And the Topologic is split itself, is a very heterogeneous. It's split by a western, more felsic half and eastern mafic half. The eastern mafic half is interpreted to be a more oceanic side of the arc, and that is what houses my rocks. While the western felsic half, while it still has mafic rocks, that hosts the Owens and Ushner rocks. So the Buckner Quadrangle, as you can see, is not complete. It's not published yet, but it has a whole multitude of colors. Very confusing just looking at it with, just looking at it. It's very, very, very confusing. So that's why I made a more simplified map. So as we can see with these small pods, these are the ultramafic rocks. They are numbered by the field localities and the order of which I visited them. We have low angled thrust faults mapped, which is partly important in interpreting the rock's origin. And as we can see here, the whole map is split almost perfectly diagonally by the Topologic Terrain to the west, northwest, and the Goochland Terrain to the southeast. And yes, the namesake of the Quadrangle, Buckner, a very, very small railroad town. Here's a overlay of the map onto a Google Earth to give you a better idea of where we're at. So as to the west, we can see that's the epicenter of the earthquake. So yeah, very nearby. Want to understand the geology. And then here we have the North Anna Nuclear Generating Station. Another reason why we kind of want to understand the geology of the area. To the west, just pretty much just off picture is I-95. And then down here we can see I-64. So into the field. So field work was conducted between June and July. Ideally, we would have done this earlier in the during junior year, but because of COVID, we had to postpone to the summer, and that made things much more difficult. One, because all the rocks are covered with this verdant, plant cover, and everything's growing. And two, it was very hot, at least on the first day we went, sunny. So in total, we visited 6 localities, 3 on each day. We would approach each locality by a vehicle. So Brent would drive his truck, I would drive my truck, and we would tail each other going to each spot. We did a lot of driving around the area, so I know the roads pretty well even after 2 days, because we would often go back and forth. We probably didn't take the best, most efficient way of visiting each locality. And then we would park either alongside the road or visit a property. We would stow our car, and then we would hop out and carry the sledge, our equipment, and we would walk. Sometimes the path we took was fairly clear, but as you see, not too clear in this photo. In total, we probably traveled 14 kilometers. I don't know how that compares to many other thesis projects. It seemed fairly decent to me, especially given that we soon had the drive and whatnot. It's still a lot of walking, and we had to take some breaks while traveling. So field excursion 1, as I was talking, that day we visited several we visited a old pine plantation and some oak forest. The first stop was the pine, and that was quite the intro to wander around the Piedmont looking for rocks, because the grass blades are sharp, the brambles pointy, and the trees very rough when you brush up against them. So we just right off the bat, we were experiencing some very hard times. This is Brent's arm after we were pretty much going on. It felt like a goose chase to me, but we were walking along, and he was leading the way for a good bit, taking the big blows for me. So thank you, Brent. Suffering. And there he is, actually sitting on one of the outcrops of ultramafic rocks. That happens to actually be locality 1. So we experienced all this hardship just walking there, but then we still had to break the rocks. But luckily we had break the rocks so we can put them in our backpacks and walk back. Luckily we had tools to make smaller chunks, more fresh samples for the taking. I was really hesitant to include this photo at first, but Brent thought it was a good picture. So that's a good sample. I'm not sure if we actually took it or not, but this day it had to be, I think it was 97 degrees Fahrenheit. And as you can see, Yeah, very, very, very hot. This, so this is actually locality 3. I don't have any pictures. Well, I have pictures of locality 2, but I didn't feel like sharing them. They're not very exciting. This outcrop happened to be at a point that looked over a lake or like marsh area. So that was very varied. And then of course, to approach that outcrop, we had to take an older farm path. And then I believe when I got out, I had to peel off at least 5 ticks from walking in the grass and the brambles to approach it. And this is actually a good character. Most of the outcrops, so outcrop 2 kind of, locality 2 kind of look like this as well. A lot of them don't look like locality 1, as these very small, unfractured rock outcrops on the hill slope. Most of them are kind of like jumbled boulders and cobbles, as we see here. So day 2, this is probably the most exemplary outcrop. That was very exciting. It was on some dude's property. It's a tinolite schist. Then we have another, again, looking very verdant, trapped in the woods, outcrop pile of rocks, oak hickory woods. Not as tough as a, recently chopped pine plantation. And then, yeah, again, last one, locality 6, Brent there for scale. This is probably, although this outcrop is mapped the smallest, it actually was like the smallest pod. It actually was the biggest outcrop of all the trekking. So we saw some things that aren't rocks, very exciting. Some little piggies. Hopefully this comes out well. I know Zoom videos don't work really well. Very cute. So we actually had to go on this property looking for some rocks. We didn't actually find it, but this dude was nice enough to take us a tour looking around. And I recall Brent was very interested in the pigs. Again, approaching another outcrop, we have a danger noodle or an eastern rat snake. And then this is a photo at locality 5. I found it first, and I was waiting for Brent to come through. And I think this photo does a good job showing just what a wall of green the Virginia forests are. So once we collect the rocks, I have to do what pretty much all the other hard rock folks have to do, and that is you cut them with a tile saw. So on the left, I'm actually in the process of cutting the rocks, sawing the rocks, and on the right, those are the products of my work. We use the small domino-sized ones for thin section, and these larger ones we use for chemical composition. And I ship those away to a different facility to process them. So the petrography, very exciting, but very difficult. So broadly speaking, I can identify like the rock types, such as like chlorite, amphibole rock, by looking through the petrographic microscope. But these rocks were very, very, very difficult. One, because I wasn't really ever really good at petrographic work in petrology, and 2, because many of the minerals, they look similar, but they're actually kind of different. And then some of the rocks, namely locality 1, have a very, very altered texture. This texture right here is called urolite, and is a result of deuterium alteration from a pyroxene to an amphibole grain. And that alteration just makes it very, very difficult to identify what exactly is there. But overall, I managed to come through, and most of the rocks, as kind of expected, are of amphibole, chlorite, and magnetite composition. So yeah, the hardest part, at least for me, was determining the amphiboles. So if you remember from mineralogy, amphiboles are separated into 3 solid solution groups. I was fortunate enough to have all 3 in my rock. But you distinguish them between their extinction angles, and if you have a good grain, you can do optics, find out the optic sign. But they're very difficult for me. Originally, I thought this particular grain is actually a tremolite, but I thought it possibly was an anthophyllite when first looking through the microscope. Which I don't have. A few rocks had relict mineralogy, and this happens to be from rocks MV26, so the 6th locality. This is relict olivine. We have some alteration to iding site on the sides. Locality 4 was the only schist of my rocks, and we can see a foliation texture here with slightly deformed actinolite grains and then fine grain chlorite in between, and then Cummingtonite grain. The Cummingtonite is fairly distinctive as opposed to the other amphibole types because it displays polysynthetic twinning and has a more somewhat bladed texture, as we can see here with the twinning and its shape. So this is what I broadly identified through the microscope. Mineral compositions, notably MV26 had a carbonate mineral, which we aren't really sure exactly what it is, but possibly dolomite or magnetite. So also besides petrographic work, had those other larger chunks, and we shipped those off to find what exactly is in the rocks. So you get this big long list of the weight percentages. And this is what we can see here for my rocks. Notably, they have fairly high magnesium numbers. Magnesium numbers is the weight percentage of magnesium divided by magnesium, weight percentage magnesium plus iron, and then times 100. And with these compositions, you can create graphs so you can understand the trends of what exactly is going on within the rock, how the types differ from each other. And then you can also make spider diagrams, such as these seen here. And these are fairly important because they can help identify what possible origins for these rocks become important later. And then normative mineralogy, so you can find from the chemical composition what the idealized mineralogy or original mineralogy of these rocks was. And broadly speaking, my rocks are in fact ultramafic. They're primarily, as you can see here, trend towards the ortho, so they lack cloudopyroxene, but they are rich in orthopyroxene, so they trended towards more of a orthoperoxenite. Again, this helps identify possible origin theories. So building conclusions for my rocks, these rocks are in fact metamorphosed ultramafic rocks. We know because they have that fairly high magnesium number, they had high chromium and nickel trace compositions, and the normative mineralogy of olivine and orthopyroxene. They plotted nicely on that. I didn't explain that too well, but on that ternary diagram, which petrologists use when making normative mineralogy to determine what the proto rock was. But also looking at the chemical composition and the mineralogy, my favored interpretation right now is that they have a likely origin as ultramafic cumulates in the Taw River amphibolite. So that's the more mafic trend of the Chopawamsic. It's traditionally called the Ta River metamorphic suite, but it's amphibolite, and that's what surrounded all the rocks. We don't think they're not ophiolites because most outcrops are far from the faults. If you remember that map, they're very far from the low angle thrust faults. They have low magnesium, calcium, but they have high aluminum content compared to traditional ophiolites, and they're enriched in, if we go back to, they have fairly high lanthanum concentrations compared to other traditional ophiolites. Now, this would be better shown if I had graphs prepared. I'm not that far along yet, but eventually, perhaps in my final talk, I'll have a good graph comparing these rocks to what we consider traditional ophiolite sequences, comparing their compositions. And these rocks aren't like directly from the mantle because their magnesium numbers are comparatively low. So that is all. Thank you. And I guess I'll accept any questions now.